Hi there, and welcome to the apocalypse. I'm John Ivison. Joining me are Marcella and Munro of Macmillan Vantage and Andrew Balfour of Rubicon Strategies. We're going to discuss the dawn of the new dark age. I'm being a little bit flippant, but it's meant to be the happiest time of the year, and I'm pretty sure we're all going through kind of flashbacks about this bleak spring of last year. So obviously that is dominating the political news as well as every other area of the news. As Omicron stalks the nation. How have our governments responded? Have they learned any lessons from the mistakes that were made in the last 18 months? Andrew, the federal government has advised against overseas travel. Apparently it wanted to go further. Apparently it wanted to introduce or reintroduce 14-day quarantine and a ban on foreign nationals. But the Premier's vetoed that. Do you think this is going to achieve anything other than chaos in the travel industry?
Well, I think a friend of mine pointed out to me last night that, and I hadn't thought of it this way, but it's an interesting way to think about it, that they're suggesting that we don't travel to places that have less COVID than we do. So, that's an odd public policy move. I think that what they're doing, and it's been the same thing throughout the entire pandemic, is that we need to protect Canadians from themselves, because left to making their own decisions, people might make some bad decisions. And kind of going ahead and doing this is what was needed to make sure people realize that going and leaving the country is a bad idea. Going to certain parts of the world is a bad idea. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be going to Europe right now. But I think, too, that while at this point in time they have ruled out any quarantines or closing borders, et cetera, that could still come based on everything we've heard today, particularly from the Ontario government science table. I also think that closing the border to the Americans when we have so many issues going on with them would have just fired up even worse things. So I think that had to have been a calculation as well.
Marcella?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I'm super frustrated. Getting news that you don't want to hear is not good. And I think lots of us, myself included, had plans to go somewhere south for a week just to, get to be somewhere warm at least, somewhere where you could be outside. And so I kind of, I've turned a bit of a corner, I have to say, because I think a year ago I was all being a very good girl and saying, this stuff is all necessary and we've got to just shut down travel, et cetera. And now I just don't understand the logic of banning international travel. And the reason why is this: like, if you're double or even triple vaxxed and you're going to you've got to take a test before you leave, you've got to wear your mask the whole time on the plane, you got to take a test before you get back into the country. I guess I just don't really understand how that's going to add to the problem with Omicron here, where we already have a problem. Do you know what I mean? So all this stuff about, like, yes, is it super transmissible? Of course. In fact, I feel like it would have been better, and some of the premiers did a bit of this yesterday, to say, the real dangers are actually in having big gatherings inside, right, without masks. That's, a very dangerous thing to do. And I wouldn't do that, but I don't know that it's not enough to prevent me, I don't think, especially my circumstance, being single, all the vaccines, et cetera. I don't know why I should be prevented from going to the States. It seems to me that's a risk that if I'm willing to take it, I should be, and that the focus should be, how are we getting more rapid tests out the door? What are we doing to make sure the schools are safer? How are we getting those vaccines, the boosters and the doses for the kids, off the shelf quicker and into arms more rapidly? And then, as I said, like, making sure, like, I would even be in favor again of a little bit of a limitation on indoor restaurant gym activities in Ontario. But I just don't see what the travel thing did, except, and this is probably the only time in the last couple of years I've agreed with Jason Kenney, is you're kind of putting a red flag in front of a bunch of Canadians who have kind of had it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pure theatre. The federal government only had a certain amount of leeway. It only controls so much. And this was one thing it controlled, and it wanted to be seen as showing some leadership in some area. I think the net result will be zero. I mean, the problem is that the public wasn't paying attention last summer when the travel advisory was still in existence, and I don't think people are going to pay attention this time either. What about at the provincial level? I mean, there are all sorts of things going on. Ontario is mass gatherings are being cut in half. whereas you can still go to a full hockey arena in British Columbia. In Ontario, they're making boosters available to people over 18 from Monday. In Quebec, nobody can get a booster, even the over 50s, an age group which I fall into, unfortunately. This is what grabbed me. Let me read this quote. This is from Dr. Carolyn Quash Tan, who you might remember. She was the woman who was the head of the Nazi advisory board, the vaccine advisory board, who said that she wouldn't give AstraZeneca to her sister. This is what she said on boosters. She's now in charge of the Quebec Immunisation Committee, and she said that if the variant causes mild infections, maybe what you should do is let people get it, and as long as it doesn't cause hospitalisation and death, that boosts the immunity naturally, and that will protect the population. So the chief advisor to Legault is saying, don't give people boosters. That shocked me. Are people shocked at what's happening at provincial levels?
No. I think that this is also the same lady who we've joked about before was like the worst interview ever, who required more media training than anyone I've ever seen. But everyone's going to have their own opinion. I don't really know how you can be the chief health advisor to a premier and go and suggest that it would be better for people to go and get sick than to get a booster. That sounds a little drastic.
It's a big if that people aren't going to be hospitalised or die as a result of it, right?
No. But just quickly jumping back, something I find interesting about this whole thing is that if Ontario or Quebec or all these provinces are going to keep bars and restaurants open, but I can't go south where I'm going to be outside all of the time, like I'm more apt to go get COVID in a bar or restaurant in Ottawa than I'm going to if I'm in insert Caribbean island where I'm.
Let's say Jamaica. How about we just say Jamaica?
Maybe.
Just for argument's sake.
Marcella, what do you think?
I mean, I think that's the frustration. Like I said, I mean, I agree with that, and I think what the real public policy challenge is at this point, it seems to. So to your point, John, so we're hearing lots of different threads all over the place. We've now gone back to like these daily press conferences from different levels of government, including the federal government. And so, how journalists are supposed to, after 2 exhausting years, keep trying to absorb all this and make sense of it in a timely fashion so that Canadians can, but how many Canadians are just going to tune out? I think that is a legitimate public policy problem here, because I feel like for those of us that did all the right things, I think there's a pretty short fuse here, and I'm hearing it not just from, I'm hearing it not just from people who are normally cranky, but from folks that just feel like, oh my goodness, like I've done everything right now. You're telling me I can't do this one thing I wanted to do, and you're still not, like I said, like you're still like, so yesterday the Ontario government had to scramble to find a way to get us rapid tests through the LCBO. Well, why were those rapid tests sitting on those shelves for so long?
Right. The rapid testing is one of the big shortfalls of provincial governments across this country, except Nova Scotia, which apparently has done a pretty good job on that front. Okay, let's shift gears. The big set piece event this week was the fiscal update. It was a bit of a Y2K when it landed, in that nothing much happened. But I do think
it wasn't a budget.
Well, it wasn't a budget, but I mean, that was the point. I guess some previous fiscal updates have been budgets, including the previous one to this one. So this is back to being just a sort of update on the numbers. But it did raise questions about the spring budget. I mean, Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, said the master plan, as she put it, will be unveiled in the spring. It will be a lot of measures designed to provoke growth. And yet, there are $78 billion worth of election promises still sitting on the shelf that were not funded in this fiscal update, and that presumably the Liberal government wants to enact at some point in the future. I wonder whether it has the money. Andrew?
Again, it's not a budget. It seemed like a lot of the commentary around it was treating it as though it's a budget, which it's not.
Well, it did spend $60-odd billion, so there was a degree of spending in it.
Of course, and we'll also see whether or not Parliament can pass Bill C2 before Parliament rises, which, if we go back into lockdowns again, that would make it so that businesses were supported, because otherwise it's not going to happen. I don't really know what the NDP are doing around that. But no, I think that the Faz painted kind of a grim picture about, it's call it $150 billion deficit. That's a lot of money. I don't think that anyone can talk their way out of that.
Marcella, do you think that there's a prospect that voters might lose patience with this kind of spend modus operandi, particularly when the results in terms of growth and improving economy are not there? I mean, all people are going to see is growing debt, growing inflation, just a worsening situation.
I think it's kind of a both and, right? Because, I mean, she was correct in pointing out that the government has gained back about 106% of the jobs that were lost. She was also correct in pointing out that we are very much in line with our partners in the G7 and the OECD in terms of spending as we felt was appropriate and necessary to protect Canadians. And I think Canadians still understand that. So while we're having stories about some of this waste that will inevitably still happen, I don't think that scares Canadians, frankly. But I do think what was interesting to me was the line of attack of the Conservatives was actually pretty sophisticated, right? Because, you know, they've been kind of you know, banging the drum, I guess you could say, on inflation for several weeks. And, you know, there's people like me who I will continue to think, yes, okay, we're still, you know, still not the worst case scenario in Canada. We still don't have as big a problem. But what I thought they did that was interesting and quite smart, right, is to point out that the government is actually in a bit of a better deficit debt situation because of inflation, whereas Canadians, right, on the other side of the inflation challenge, are paying higher price for everything. And so it was a very smart kind of pocketbook argument, sort of suggesting, not saying it, but sort of suggesting, well, part of the reason you don't care about inflation is because it's good for your bottom line.
You're profiteering. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, it was a whopping amount of money. It was $38 billion more than they had budgeted for in the last spring budget. Appeared on the revenue side, largely because of inflation. So yeah, I mean, it kind of worked out for the federal government. Without it, if they hadn't had that, they probably would not have been able to do what they did on COVID relief in this.
Well, but just quickly, though, on the other side of the ledger, if you look at it, what Omicron is going to do is it's going to make it so that there's going to be delays, I should say, in interest rate hikes, which is actually going to be to the benefit of Canadians. So, you know.
Well, it may be, but then it might not cure the inflationary problem we've got. So yeah, anyway, we could go around in circles on inflation, unemployment, COVID. Okay, last thing, finally, the pressure on the federal government to do something about Bill 21, the Quebec Bill 21, where almost in my backyard, the local elementary school grade 3 teacher was removed from the classroom, her classroom, for wearing hijab. It takes a lot to get the residents of Chelsea riled up, but there were 200 of them outside the local MNA's office yesterday, who is a member of the CAC party. The consensus appears to be from mayors and from MPs that the federal government should intervene in the Supreme Court case if and when it happens, and this Supreme Court takes a look at whether this is constitutional or not. I just want to read you a quote from Andre Pratt, who knows a thing or two about this stuff, former senator, former editor-in-chief of La Presse. He said in our paper today, if the Supreme Court ever declares Bill 21 unconstitutional, the anger and frustration in Quebec will reach levels last seen when the Meech Lake Accord failed. Marcella, do you think we're on the road to another referendum here?
Well, we're definitely on the road to a more significant confrontation. You know, I think the other interesting thing is to note how popular this government in Quebec still is with the people of Quebec. So there's not a lot, there doesn't seem to be a lot of angst in Quebec, even with this very, you know, whenever you can personalize a human rights challenge, and we know this historically, right? When you could put a face, and especially a kind face, to an issue of discrimination, you can get people's attention very quickly because suddenly it's about a human being. It's not about some, you know, esoteric legal challenge. Yeah. So I think, you know, the rest of Canada now, the federal government and the federal oppositions, they're in a bit of a pickle because they know that this stuff is super popular in Quebec. None of them really want to get too offside with Quebecers. But on the other hand, the rest of the country has now had a human face put to something that is quite outrageous and just, not just, as someone said on Twitter the other day, this isn't just symbolic racism, this is racism.
Yeah,
right?
well, I mean, we had grade 3 students writing letters to the teacher saying how much they loved her and drawing pictures of her. I mean, this was, if you're a politician and you're on the other end of that, it can't be good. And yet, all around me, my francophone neighbours are telling me this will never change in Quebec. It's deep-seated, and we can call it racism, or we can call it just a desire to separate church and state. But, clearly, to me, it is beyond the pale, and it's an infringement on religious rights and human rights. Andrew, I mean, should we be sitting on our hands just in case we upset the separatists?
Well, let's look at it in a little different way. I mean, this is good politics for Legault. He doesn't need seats in the city of Montreal. I still find it shocking that he won seats in Western Quebec, where you are. This plays well for him in the places that he needs to win seats to continue being premier. I don't think that this is really anything other than banging the drum to make sure that he continues to be premier. I do think that it's interesting, if you look at it on the federal level, that in both major, I won't offend people in other political parties, but in the Conservative and Liberal Party, there's now dissension. People are speaking out and saying that I thought it was odd that a member of Parliament from British Columbia from the Conservative Party was one speaking out, but this is, the federal leaders want to stay away from this because there's not a win for them. And particularly if you're the Prime Minister, you don't like tinkering in Quebec. So there's, rabbit holes everywhere here.
Absolutely. Okay, well, that's all we've got time for. We'll be back next week to give our end-of-year roundup. That is if the world hasn't ended in the meantime. So good luck to all of us.
Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye.